the Hollywood casting couch has been a real thing for many years. And we saw it in the Weinstein case. We see it in the music industry with R. Kelly. We see, Diddy under investigation, his house is being raided. And so because it's coming out now, and because some of these allegations go back 10, 20 years, it breeds, some suspicion, understandably so, that this has been going on a long time. I think when it comes to children and pedophile rings, I mean, look, Drake Bell talked about this. Now, were there a series of abusers in the Drake Bell case? No, this seems to be isolated to one predator. But there are other celebrities out there who claim that they were serially abused. And, there's reason to believe that some of this is true.
Chris, welcome to the Freedom Pact podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
Well, thank you, Lewis, for having me. I appreciate it.
The first place I'd love to start, and I want to touch on some of your personal story later on, but when it comes to topics like this, when it comes to so much of the viral content you've put out, the incredible successful shows, like To Catch a Predator, Hansen versus Predator, now Takedown, what is it about this content that people seem to gravitate towards? Because this isn't just content people enjoy. This is content that has the potential to go viral.
Well, I think it's a combination of things. In the beginning, we merely partnered with an online watchdog group called Perverted Justice, which, was doing this work on its website and exposing men trying to meet children for sex. And we figured if we could use those decoys in a sting operation where we had a house wired with hidden cameras and microphones, it could be pretty compelling. Now, we didn't know if anybody was going to show up, of course, but they did. And the first sting we did in 2.5 days, 17 men surfaced, including a New York City firefighter. When it finally aired, it got a big response. It was compelling. And I think what we did there and what we've continued to refine in the 20 years since, I can't believe it's been 20 years since we did that first investigation, but we found a way to take people inside the commission of a felony. Yeah. We figured out a way to do it where the target, the predator, if you will, doesn't usually know he's on camera. I mean, intellectually, he may figure it out, but he doesn't see the cameras right away. So he's in his natural environment. We see him walk in. We see him in some cases have an interaction with a decoy, an on-site decoy. And so we watch this crime take place in real time. And then you have the confrontation, the interview. And my theory on this has always been anybody, any presenter can walk out or jump out from behind a curtain or a set of bushes and create 10 seconds of dramatic video. My job is to get inside this guy's head, because if we can do that and understand the mind of a predator, a criminal, we can better protect other people. And so when all this combines with, the obvious drama that it brings, as well as some, admittedly dark, humorous moments, I think it's a cauldron of interest for our viewers. You don't see it that often on television anywhere. And so I think what we've come up with is something that's very edgy, very educational, and very experiential for the audience.
You mentioned the interviews there. This is probably the most compelling part and I think this is a great example of the difference in level between professional journalism and citizen journalism. The interviews you conduct really do dive into the psyche of these people. And I mentioned that the citizens journalism, your shows and the content you've put out have had a massive ripple effect across the world. After your show really hit the heights, we've seen so many other similar shows, people recording on their iPhone, even trying to do a similar thing. But for those, they had something to model themselves on. For you, you were really a pioneer in this space. I wonder what sort of hurdles you met in the beginning, because there was no blueprint really for you to follow like there is today.
No, but we had done investigative stories, hidden camera stories, where we had gone overseas, for instance, to India to document child slave labor, or to Cambodia to expose sex tourism, the exploitation of 4, 5, and 6-year-old children for sex by Americans and Western Europeans. So I had a sense of obviously how this works. I mean, everything from bike thieves to hardened criminals overseas to counterfeit drug manufacturers in China. We had done those stories, and some of it was after the Predator investigation started, and we learned a lot of lessons about doing those sort of enterprise stories because of the Predator investigations, no question. But we had some experience there. But again, you're right. I mean, imagine the first guy walking in on a Thursday afternoon in a home we rented from a retired cop in Bethpage, Long Island. And in those early investigations, we didn't collaborate with law enforcement. I had my security guy there, Ronnie Knight, who was, there to protect me and to keep a safe environment. But, a stranger is walking in after having a sexually charged conversation with someone he thought was a child, and I'm going to come out and interrogate him about this. And it's very unpredictable. Now, we make this as safe as we can, but it is that unpredictability, that edginess, that what is this guy going to do? Is he going to run? Is he going to talk to me? What's he going to do? That, I think, is part of what makes this so compelling. But we did operate, and we still do somewhat, without a net, because you don't know how this guy's going to react. Now, I have a sense of it after having done it so many times. In the current investigations, we just finished one last week in Alabama, we have law enforcement there. So if it does go sideways, we're pretty protected. And the Predator would be overwhelmed by, the presence of law enforcement. And I've gotten pretty good at diffusing the situation, de-escalating the situation. If somebody gets, heavy with me, I know how to back it off usually. And if I can't, then I just get out of the way and let law enforcement do its job.
Is that skill of being able to diffuse a situation something that you've sort of always had, or is this something you've had to actually study over the years to master that craft?
I think it's a lot of on-the-job training.
Yeah.
I think in any interview, a good interviewer is a good listener. And whether it's been for a feature story or a business story or a crime investigative story, which is mostly what I do, you listen and you wait for the moments. And I liken it to being an anesthesiologist. Sometimes you're hovering this interview subject between life and death, and you have to know the moment to say, look, I need to know this. And you're not going to want to talk about it, but you sort of need to here. So help me to understand. And I think you get a lot more information and you get a much more compelling interview by doing that. And I also think that sometimes interviewers are so nervous about dead air. And sometimes dead air can be your friend. Explain. Let the silence hang there for a minute. Let them figure out what they're going to say. I'm in no rush. I'm here to get your story.
When these videos go viral and people see them, they see the 10-minute end result. They don't see the sort of back end of what goes into one of these
Sure.
stings. If you could best explain the sort of workload and the process that goes into just one of these stings.
Well, we have to, first of all, establish a relationship with the law enforcement agency or agencies with which we're working. And so there's a fair amount of production time and research and relationship building that goes into that. Sometimes that can be, a matter of weeks, or sometimes it could be a year. And each agency operates a little bit differently. Some of the stings we embed in are multi-agency task forces. So we need to be able to, have access to federal agencies in some cases. And that's a bit of a process, but we've been able to do it. But once we get that done, there's a location scout. Where is this going to happen? Is it going to be in a house? Are we going to use multiple locations? Is there a hotel room involved? Is there a trailer home involved? Is there a park bench? How do we cover all those things with our cameras? So it's not just me confronting this guy. I've got to have, 4+ camera operators a couple of sound people, and everything that goes along with it, the gear, the furniture, if the Sting house is unfurnished, everything that we need. And there's always a last minute scramble for something, a wall hanging or a pot to put a hidden camera in, or can we use the tree, or we don't have a ladder for that. Where do we get a ladder? And so it is a little bit of a scramble. And sometimes it's not all together when the first guy comes knocking on the door. So we have to improvise. And that's the art of it, really, is just to be ready and to improvise and to capture the moment. Because if we don't capture the moment, then in terms of our viewers, it doesn't exist.
And again, this is the difference, I think, between the professional level and the amateur level. There's obviously a lot of legality around topics like this, and you have to make sure, you come with the correct facts, that you're operating within the right perimeters, that all the sort of right legal framework is in place. Is that something that's one of the more difficult sides of it, or is that pretty straightforward now?
Now it's straightforward. In the beginning, prior to collaborating with law enforcement in the first two investigations, we were, finding these people. They had committed a crime, obviously. They had no reasonable expectation for privacy because they had this solicitation of a child online and then showed up at a house to allegedly have sex with the child. So you lose your presumption of privacy there. So legally, I think we were in a good space very early on. And this, as you can imagine, the first time we did this was very heavily legally reviewed. We had finished the shoot in February and it didn't air until the following September. So there was a lot of production, a lot of tweaking, a lot of how do we present this? Some of this material is shocking. How is the audience going to respond to this? Now the audience, or my audience at least, expects this level of enterprise reporting every time I do a story. I've set the bar very high. And so either informationally, it's got to be very compelling, or, that information combined with video, you're not going to see anywhere else. So, people expect a lot out of what we do at TruBlu and the other platforms upon which our material broadcasts from. So it's a little bit of a burden, but it's also energized me to keep pushing to the next level, to keep trying to find innovative and creative ways and enterprising ways to tell a story. And I think that's been good. It's healthy. It keeps me very focused and very engaged in this business that I've been in for 42 years now.
I say there's a lot of improvisation and
yes,
there's a lot of nuance to this, and
sure.
Each case is very different. You don't know what to expect. You could probably build a pretty good picture when you're entering into a case, but that moment where Chris Hansen steps out, you don't really know how that person's going to react. Are you very nervous about that initial reaction? Because I'm assuming you'll pretty much know in the first 5 seconds what type of conversation or interaction that's going to be.
Yeah. I've read the chat logs, before the person shows up in most cases, unless there's some, shocking twist where he's right around the corner and, surprises us. But, and sometimes, the decoys who are chatting and they're law enforcement people, you get going with 5 or 6 chats at the same time. And it is possible that the guy you think is showing up is actually somebody else. So that's happened. Sometimes 2 guys will show up at the same time. So there are times when you go out there and you aren't as prepared as you want to be, not because it's anybody's fault. Just that's the nature of this sort of enterprise investigation. So then you really have to improvise, because you don't know who this guy is and you don't actually have the chats in front of you. You've really got to engage him, and that obviously he's crossed the threshold. Otherwise, the address wouldn't have been given out. See, law enforcement doesn't actually tell these guys where we're at unless this chat has been reviewed and, law enforcement official has said, okay, there's probable cause that a crime has been committed. When they show up and talk to me or they talk to law enforcement, that's in many cases just confirmation of what they were going to do. But the crime is actually committed online. But yeah, you've got to be on your feet. You've got to listen. You got to pay attention. And you don't know always that much about them. In this most recent sting, a week ago or so, we had guys ranging in age from 70 to 22. Some of the men were actually fans of the show. Go figure that, but showed up anyway. Some were sorry, contrite, apologetic, and some were just plain mad. Mad that we still do this, and mad they got caught. And blame me and blame law enforcement for the situation they're now in, which obviously is not legitimate, but that's how people's minds work sometimes.
Now, this is a really interesting point you made there. Some of these people, they're fans of Chris Hansen. They know exactly the risk involved in doing what they do. Now, you see some of these things, and you see some of the guys when you come out. Some of them, they almost look starstruck. There's almost a smile on their face. They think that's Chris Hansen. Now, they must to that point, to be a fan of you, they must know that what they're doing prevents a very, good risk that this could end their life as they know it. So if they know to that detail, why are they still turning up?
Well, I think it's an addiction for these guys. I mean, I think I've heard it likened to a heroin addiction. The heroin addict knows that there's a 20% chance there could be fentanyl in his heroin, but they want the heroin so badly that they show up to get it anyway. And they inject it, they inhale it, they do whatever they do with it. The man who's got a propensity for sex with a child knows there's a 20% chance it's Sheriff Chris Swanson or Sheriff Grady Judd's people or Chris Hansen or Sheriff Mark Moon or any one of the law enforcement agencies with which we work. But they figure there's only a 20% chance. I'm going to risk it because I want to fulfill this fantasy of having sex with a child.
Now, this is an interesting question because I've had this when I've spoken to undercover police, and I spoke to one member of the undercover police veteran in Australia. He's taken down some of the biggest criminal cases in Australia. He's dealt with some of the baddest people you could imagine. And he told me when it comes to the point of turning these people in, completing the sting, there's almost a little bit of empathy and a little bit of doubt or this feeling of, have I done something wrong, that just creeps into the back of the mind. There's got to be that level of empathy. Is that something you experience at all, or do you have to just remind yourself why you're there?
Well, yeah, of course you have empathy. And, a lot of these guys say, I've never done this before, it's my first time. Well, I don't believe all of them. Obviously, some of them have to have a first time at some point, doing this sort of thing. But you do feel sorry for a 70-year-old who's got a wife of 40 years at home and children in his 30s, who walks in and he tries to run, but he can't because he's slow moving at 70. And he sits down and tells you how he's seen all the stories and thanks you for protecting children. And then the obvious question, what are you doing here? And he goes on into very personal detail about, he hasn't had much of a sex life and he was trying to spark it up. And I said, with a 15-year-old girl? And, well, it was stupid. I shouldn't have done it. But then you think, all right, if we weren't here and there was a teenage girl here, and that happens every day across the country, across the world, what was going to happen? And there would have been a sexual assault of a child, a statutory rape in all likelihood. And you prevented that. And each one you prevent, you exponentially prevented many others. So you start to feel a little less sorry for these guys. I wish them well in terms of getting help and not being overpunished, getting the appropriate punishment. These guys aren't all the same guy, right? There are the first-time guys. There are guys who are socially inept, who are young, who think this is going to be okay. And if the relationship works out, it's a Romeo and Juliet thing and it'll all be fine. Not a good excuse, but it's the excuse in their head. And then there's the hardcore heavy hitters we see. And those guys, yeah, they should go away for a very long time. The others are someplace in between. And it's a very individual, specific punishment treatment plan that needs to be put into place. Some guys can go on probation and register as a sex offender and, get treatment and never offend again. I believe that. Some guys, can't. And so we as a society have to, be very careful who we allow to have that break and who we say, you got to go away. And it's not easy. And it's not a very glamorous part of psychiatry. And it's not an exact law enforcement science. So we're all trying to figure out what's best here. And so it comes down for me, given all that, and none of it's solved, and it'll all go on, and the discussions will happen forever, and the predators will find different ways of contacting children because it's not going away. So what does that tell you? What it tells me is that this all comes down to the best defense being the relationship between a parent and child. And if your child feels comfortable enough coming to you and saying, look, this happened, and I'm going to share this with you. I know you're not going to take away my internet and all the communication with my friends or the online games or anything like that. You have a much better chance of protecting your child online. It's just like with the sextortion issue that we have here in the States. You know, these kids are being tricked by scam artists half a world away into sending explicit photos, and then they drain them of whatever money they have. And they get so embarrassed because the scammer, who's posed as a, good-looking teenage girl, ends up being a Nigerian con artist, and they start sending these naughty pictures around to friends and relatives. They take their own lives because at that age, 15, 16, they can't see through this. And opposed to going to your dad and saying, hey, I screwed up, and having nobody even think about this after 2 weeks, they get caught up in the moment. And some of these kids are committing suicide. So you got to let your kid know, that there's danger out there. There's people who are going to groom you. You have to start this discussion at a very early age, the moment they have access to the internet. And it starts with, look, there are grown-ups online who like to trick kids. Kids don't like to be tricked. And you start there, and you have to continue the conversation as they grow up and get more mature and have greater access to the internet. I am a firm believer in that. Demand reduction is difficult here. Punishment is inconsistent. The best defense is the relationship that parents have with their children. That's it.
I'm not a father yet. I hope to be one day, but this is one of the things that scares me the most when I think about it, especially with how big a technology has become, the importance on technology. I feel like you can't keep your kids hidden away from technology, because then that knocks them back in school, it knocks them back in their career. But there has to be a sort of balance there. So we can't just restrict them. How do we have those conversations? Because I think a lot of people, they either don't know how to approach it or they're too embarrassed to approach it. What would your advice be to a parent whose child is starting to use the internet?
I think it starts with a very basic conversation that is age appropriate. And it really does come down to saying there are grown-ups on the internet who like to trick kids. Kids do not like to be tricked. If you don't know somebody in real life, you don't know them on the internet. Sometimes people pretend to be your friend for a lot of different reasons. They want to take your money. They want to trick you into doing things that you probably shouldn't do at your age, or we know you shouldn't do at your age. Don't get tricked. Kids don't like to be tricked. They really don't. And that's an innate thing in all children, I think. And again, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a child psychologist. I just have interviewed 500 or 600 of these guys, maybe more. I've interviewed parents of children who have been victimized. I've interviewed children. I'll never forget one time early on in the predator investigations, we had a group of about a dozen middle schoolers, 13 years old. And we had them all sitting in a group, just like at an assembly. And I said to them, how many of you have had contact online with a grown-up and it made you feel uncomfortable? Everyone raised their hands, all 10 or 12. And then I said, how many of you told your parents? Maybe 3 raised their hands. I said, why not? We were afraid they were going to take the internet away, our access to the internet, afraid they were going to take our computers away. And that was the most stunning lesson of all of this, which is you got to tell your kids, if they do mess up, if they do have a conversation, okay, tell me about it. If somebody approaches you, tell me about it. We'll make this an investigative game. Or, you don't even have to bring up the police. Just tell them that they need to tell you. And you can handle the rest of it. I think that if something like that happens, local police departments and sheriff's offices are more likely than ever to take the complaint and investigate it because it's so clearly on their radar that, and they have had so much success tracking these guys down that it's not a matter of, oh, yeah, well, keep a better close eye on your kids. They'll do something about it in most cases. So, if it gets to that point, you got to report it. And in the meantime, you got to let your kids know that it's okay to tell you about stuff that happens online. And this goes for games. If they're playing Roblox or they're playing whatever game is the hottest game today, you have to let them know that, just because somebody says they're a kid may not mean they're a kid. So be careful and let me know if anything makes you uncomfortable.
You mentioned there Roblox. That just triggered something in my mind. Wasn't there a big sort of scandal around sort of these child predatory issues and that game in particular? Do you remember that?
I think there was an issue on Roblox, and I don't know the specifics of it, but I think all games have the potential to create in a bad situation. Whether it's Roblox, I don't mean to isolate Roblox because it's the same thing could happen on Discord, or the same thing could happen with kids following somebody on YouTube. And we've done stories on that. Sometimes these content creators, they exploit children. And when you have an environment where children can have contact with adults or adults have contact with children, reach out and groom them, there's danger. If you've seen Quiet on the Set, that great documentary that just came out. These directors, producers did a fine job of getting some of these then young people to talk to them about the exploitation that went on at that network. And it's frightening. But again, when you have unchecked access by adults to children, you create the opportunity for exploitation. And there's no parent on the set. Nobody's looking out for the kid, and the kid's there to try to satisfy, to try to, please the adult, and it creates the environment potentially for exploitation.
You mentioned there Quiet on Set, absolutely heartbreaking documentary, and the account particularly of Drake Bell's father, who noticed quite early on some warning signs and almost found himself ostracized from the entire group of and other parents included. And you see stuff going on in such a company like that is so obviously child oriented. You think that measures would be in place to support parents in that position. Did what we saw on that documentary shock you in any way, or were you not surprised with all the experience you had?
I think it's shocking. Nothing surprises me anymore. Sadly, I think it's shocking that was allowed to happen at a major children's network. Yeah, it's shocking. It should shock everybody. Surprising, not necessarily to me. I mean, these, whispers have been around for many years about this sort of activity. And, like all this stuff, whether it was our, investigation years ago that was on Discovery Plus on Onision, the big content creator who was alleged to have, exploited young women, or any of these others, Peter Nygaard or Quiet on the Set, you have to commit to this project for a significant period of time to get the access that you need. And I think Drake Bell was incredibly brave to come forward. And obviously it took the directors and producers of this project, some time to gain his trust and to have discussions. And he did it. And he spoke for a lot of other children. He spoke for a lot of other survivors. And this is something that he could have just moved on and never talked about. And that would be his right. But the fact that he did share this, I think is going to help a lot of other survivors cope, heal, and perhaps come forward. I mean, one of the things that touches me most about the entire Predator franchise is that almost weekly, if I'm out and about here or anywhere, somebody will approach me and say, "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" And I said, "Absolutely." And they'll say something along the lines of, "Thank you. Something happened to me as a child. And every time I see you confront one of these guys, it's a victory for me because my guy either wasn't confronted or wasn't punished or disappeared or we never found him or, law enforcement didn't act, whatever it was. But that is the most gratifying thing to me about all of this is that it gives a victory, a win for survivors. And the survivors are the heroes in all this because they're the ones who have to come forward and break the cycle in their own lives. And it's not an insignificant thing to do.
When I hear you speak about this, I can hear the passion in your voice. I can tell how much this means to you. And you mentioned there about all those interactions you've had with survivors along the way that sort of keep the fire burning within you, I imagine. But at the beginning, why did you feel so passionate about this to begin with?
Well, I think in the beginning, I thought it was a compelling story. Now, again, did we know people were going to show up? No. I was driving out to the first location and got caught in traffic. And I thought, gosh, what if nobody shows up? What if I've just wasted tens of thousands of dollars of the network's money? I wasn't going to be a popular guy, a week from now. But I mean, they would have understood, I would think. But still, then to see 17 guys surface, was eye-opening. But there's, it wasn't an exact science. It wasn't a sure thing. And so once I started doing it, and I came to grips with not just the situation that was out there, but the fact that there were so many of these guys. I mean, by the time we got to the third investigation, we had 51 guys surface in a 3-day period in Riverside County, California. And it was just overwhelming. It was hard to get your arms around. And the fact that we're still doing this 20 years later, and guys are walking in and before I can say a word, oh, you're Chris Hansen. This is pretty cool. I said, no, it's not cool at all. It's not cool one bit. Have a seat right over there. We're going to have a discussion. So I am passionate about it. I'm passionate about this especially and all the other topics in the documentaries we're working on for TruBlu and other platforms as well. But I think, you talk about other projects and we do the podcast Predators I've Caught, and it ends up being somewhat therapeutic for me. People always ask, do you ever go to therapy? Does it ever get dark for you? Does it, do you ever worry that there's no redeeming value in society? I said, no, I'm a pretty cheery guy actually, but the podcast does allow me to talk about it and to go back into detail. And that discussion that I have with the listeners every week does end up being very therapeutic. And in a weird way, I look forward to doing the episode every week because for some reason, it comforts me. And I don't know whether it's because I know that a lot of people are listening and they care and it creates this relationship that I have with the audience, or because, deep down, it disturbed me so that I can release the demons by talking about it. Maybe it's a little bit of both, I think, probably.
You mentioned the podcast there and the conversations that you have. I wonder if you would ever, not to give anyone a sort of platform or spotlight, but I think it would be a compelling listen to talk to someone who you have caught doing this before and what that conversation would look like and
Absolutely.
How the impact it's had on them.
That's a great point. Yeah. I mean, I reach out to each and every one of the guys who we profile in the podcast. And I reach out to virtually everyone who I've caught. And some of them, some episodes, they talk to me, and it's very revealing. We had a story, it's up on TruBlu right now. People can check it out and watch TruBlu.com and figure out how to subscribe and watch it. But we had a 61-year-old doctor who was caught in one of our stings a year ago. And he went through the system. He was a first-time offender. It was particularly jarring because here's a guy who is at his medical office, doctor's office, as a family practitioner. And while seeing 18 patients, he continued a conversation with someone he thought was a teenage girl, showed graphic photos, came to the house to meet her, had wine and Oreo cookies and, Coca-Cola, and was, walked in and grabbed her right on the bottom. And we caught him. And it was a big deal at the time. Well, after his sentencing, and he got probation, and he had to register as a sex offender, and there were some other public service things he had to do. he actually sat for an in-depth interview with me, which we have on TruBlu now. And it's very compelling because he talks about his sexual addiction to pornography. And there's very definitely a link for many people between the obsession with pornography and offending. Oh. At some point, especially with people who view, what's considered child pornography, the level of satisfaction of watching it isn't enough. And there will be a certain number of those people offending. And that's just fact. And so it was very compelling to hear this doctor talk about all this. And it's in a 2-part special that's on TruBlu right now. People should check it out.
Absolutely. I will link that in the description for everyone who wants to click on that link and find out how to subscribe there. When you talk about this, and I get that sense of meaning and purpose coming through your words, just generally speaking, how important do you think it is for people to find a sense of meaning in what they do? Because I imagine, when you've had a long work week and you've been filming and it's grinding you down, everyone feels burnout. I imagine having a sense of meaning like you've got with what you do and knowing how many people it impacts, that's probably what gets you out of bed on those mornings.
Well, you have to. I mean, imagine these, what the audience sees is a percentage of what we do. And, there have been sting operations where I've worked, from 3 p.m. until 6 o'clock in the morning and taken a nap and gone to give a speech because I happen to be, booked someplace to do something for an event in that same town. And then turn back around and go back that night. And, you're on your feet. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of false starts. There's a lot of, oh my God, he's here. And it's not like you can go take a nap someplace. And so it is grueling to do one of these investigations. And that's just the nature of it. It's not for everybody. I do it because I think it's important and it's compelling and it helps people. It educates and creates awareness and a dialogue that needs to exist. But yeah, it takes a little out of you every time you do it. There's no question. It's a lot. But it knowing what it accomplishes is definitely, of help to keep on moving, keep on doing it. And I'm surrounded by a great team and very supportive people, and law enforcement agencies, and the number of agencies with which we collaborate grows weekly. There's the constant growing list of agencies who want to do this and are preparing to do it with us. So I don't see stopping anytime soon.
You mentioned earlier that there are some, it's hard to say comedy in situations like this, but there are some viral Chris Hansen moments that, sure, that they've gone crazy viral, and people, they try and replicate them. Most notably the pizza video. With things like that, what's the thought process? Is that premeditated, or are those organic moments?
I think what makes them so viral is that they're organic. I mean, yeah, I give some thought to, what do I say if this guy does this, or what if this happens? But you can't predict a guy eating a piece of pizza all the way through. You can't predict a guy who has something in his pocket that is, alarming or humorous or, something that's just out of the ordinary. And you can't predict what a guy is going to say. So you really have to be on your toes to seize that moment. And if it is darkly humorous, then you let that play out. And I think, again, it just leads people to watch it more, which exposes people more to the issue, which creates the dialogue and awareness that is important. So I don't mind, having a darkly humorous moment, and I'll exploit that in my own way, because it is something. And we saw 2 or 3 viral moments in this last investigation. When you see them in a couple weeks, it'll blow your mind. I mean, this is the sort of thing that, what these guys told me in some cases, and you'll see it soon on TruBlu, it is absolutely mind-boggling. The sort of thing where I'm finished with my interview, the sheriff's excuse me, the sheriffs are going to take him away. And then a guy volunteers something totally out of the blue. And I said, what? And of course, we're rolling on the whole thing. We never stop rolling. And he explains it again, and we get back into the interview. I mean, unbelievable what we got in this last investigation.
Wow. I think we're all excited to see that. So yeah, I will link below for everyone to stay tuned, and we'll all be waiting for that one. Just a few questions before I let these guys know where they can find you, and we wrap up. We touched on a little bit when we talked about quiet on set. I wonder what your opinion is when you hear these theories of sort of Hollywood being so excessively linked with child abuse and sort of paedophile ring theories. It seems to pour gasoline on the fire when cases come out like a Drake Bell. Is that just because, these are the stories we're more likely to hear about on the news, and so we've drawn this parallel between child abuse and Hollywood, or is there any sort of credibility? How do you view those theories?
Well, I think, the Hollywood casting couch has been a real thing for many years. And we saw it in the Weinstein case. We see it in the music industry with R. Kelly. We see, Diddy under investigation, his house is being raided, allegations of human trafficking. And maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, this wouldn't have reached the public view. And so because it's coming out now, and because some of these allegations go back 10, 20 years, it breeds, some suspicion, understandably so, that this has been going on a long time. I think when it comes to children and pedophile rings, I mean, look, Drake Bell talked about this. Now, were there a series of abusers in the Drake Bell case? No, this seems to be isolated to one predator. But there are other celebrities out there who claim that they were serially abused. And, there's reason to believe that some of this is true. So is there a cabal of blood-drinking pedophiles in Hollywood? Probably not. Has this been an issue, and does it continue to be an issue because unfettered, unregulated, unlimited access between adults and children can breed exploitation? Yeah, it's a problem. And it's also a problem online when you have parents exploiting their children to make money on YouTube or on Instagram, where you've got mothers having their teenage daughters pose in scantily clad outfits under the guise of trying on makeup or, being a fashion model or an influencer. And you've got guys signing up for this who are pedophiles, who are predators. And that kind of exploitation is just as bad as anything that goes on in Hollywood. But yeah, anytime you have unchecked access between adults and children, and the children have a motivation and incentive to please the adult, it has the potential for exploitation. There's no question. And so it breeds suspicion when you see that environment created over and over again.
On the topic of the elite, I think a lot of people will be surprised to hear this, but I heard you talk about this in another interview. There was a time where you were doing some investigative journalism into the Epstein case. Sure. What was the result of that, and what were the findings, and what were the major roadblocks there?
Well, I had been talking to, in 2015, 2016, some investigators who've been working with, lawyers representing potential victims of Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein. And, he had already faced charges, and there was a guilty plea in the case down in Florida, done his time. And there was some pretty compelling evidence that this had continued, that it was a wider exploitation involving human trafficking than had been exposed. And we tried to get pretty fancy with it in terms of trying to fashion some sort of a sting, trying to, figure out a way to catch somebody in the act, in New York or in Florida. And we worked it. And honestly, we just got busy with other stories. And it was the Miami Herald, actually, and Julie K. Brown, the reporter down there, and some others, who kept digging and digging and digging away at the story. And it was the Miami Herald and Julie K. Brown, who convinced some of the survivors to speak publicly. And that's what turned that case. That's what allowed the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York to close the loop, if you will, and to indict Jeffrey Epstein and arrest him when he came back from France. And the U.S. attorney at the time said so himself. So it speaks to the importance of local news, local newspapers grinding away at these stories. And it speaks to, when you are at a network or you're doing global stories, just because you can't do it initially the way you want to do it, you still have to stick with it if you care about that story. And, the Peter Nygaard story, the predator story, and he's still working his way through the court system. The 4-hour series we did for Discovery Plus. I mean, that was 2 years of my life playing a 3D game of chess to put that all together. And the New York Times did some great reporting on it too. A lot of people did. Canadian Broadcast Network did. A lot of people with that story, but it takes a lot out of you, and you really have to be focused, and you can't do every one of those stories. But thankfully, as far as I can tell, someone has been up to the task and someone has done it, whether it's been Quiet on the Set or the stuff that I've done or the stuff the Miami Herald did. That's the importance of journalism, whether it's a network thing or you have your own network or whether you're working in local news. That's why this business counts.
Beautifully said, and totally agree. The last question I'll ask you before I ask our sign-off question I ask every guest. When I mentioned you were coming on the show to our audience, this was one of the questions that was put to me the most. And we've kind of touched on it when we've been talking about people who have been influenced by your work. Today with YouTube, obviously, there's so many channels out there who try and replicate a similar formula and trying to achieve the same things that you try to achieve. Some are quite big. There's even one who sort of plays a sort of character version of you. I think he's called Chris Hansen. When you see these channels, how do you view them? Do you view them critically and look at what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong? Do you think that a lot of them are handled badly? What's your general view on the I don't want to say the word copycats, but you know where I'm getting at.
Well, I don't pay a lot of attention to them. There have been other stories I've done where some of these other content creators have been tangentially involved. And I think the danger here, and again, I think citizen journalism is very important. Podcasts are very important. The crowdsourcing of information that can solve crimes is very important. And people should have access to platforms to tell their stories. And that's a great thing about YouTube and the other platforms. But I think there's a danger when somebody does it sheerly for clicks or bait and it's not done well. It's not done with protections. These cases are usually not prosecuted. And so you've got a guy who may have done something very wrong, and some bad guys have been exposed by, vigilante content creators. There's no question. Some have been prosecuted. Most of them have not. And they create a dangerous environment potentially. So you've got a guy who baits somebody out with nobody checking to make sure the chats are actually cross the threshold or break the law. He shows up, they confront them in whatever way they do it, and claims that he's with some official predator hunting group. And so they have this moment of a guy who did something bad, who now can't be prosecuted. And then in some cases, they call law enforcement, which is just calling 911 and saying they've got a guy here who may or may not have committed a crime. And then you've got the potential for a law enforcement officer to go into a very volatile situation without having any background on it. And so it creates this cauldron, this confluence of events that is dangerous. And while it may expose somebody who's a predator, they don't get prosecuted. So what have you achieved at the end of the day, except for trying to get clicks and make money on the internet? Now, I get into trouble every time I say that, and this will air, and I'll get hate on my various social media platforms. But it's the truth, and I'm just going to tell you the way it is. Those cases don't get prosecuted. Prosecutors don't like those groups generally, and police don't like those groups generally. And the groups say, well, it's because we're doing something law enforcement can't do. That's not always true. In most cases, it's not true. So there you have it. That's my position on it.
The final question I have for you today, Chris, I ask every guest this on the show, so it's not specific to the individual work. I ask this to everyone, and the answer can be absolutely anything. It could be to do with your work. It could be to something more personal. But right now in this moment, for Chris Hansen, what makes life worth living?
What makes life worth living for Chris Hansen is to have the family I have, a wife, children, to have a mission, to be surrounded by friends of many years, and to be able to live comfortably and do the work I think is important. And to see all my kids, all my nieces, all my nephews, my godson prosper in a way that you could never imagine. Generationally, my team, my group is reaching new heights in just being good human beings and following their passions and being productive members of society. And it really makes me feel like, I'm on top of the world. And to the extent that I had any influence on any of them, well, I'm a blessed human being.
Yeah, beautifully said, sir. Sounds like a life well lived. So
very lucky
thank
man.
you so much for that. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been one of my goals for a long time to speak to you.
I'm
and
glad
have
it
you
all
on the
worked
show.
out. I'm glad it all worked out. I know, we run a pretty hectic schedule with all of the stuff that's on my calendar, and sometimes it's frustrating for folks who want to get you on their show. But I'm glad this worked out. It was a pleasure for me as well, and good luck with everything you do.
I appreciate it, sir. Just before you go, if we just let everyone know, TruBlu, watch TruBlu.com, where they can find all of your latest content. Also, the podcast, Predators I Have Caught. Where else can we send these guys to? Where can they follow you on social media as well?
Social media is at Chris Hansen on Twitter, official Chris Hansen on Instagram, TikTok, have a seat with Chris Hansen. We're on TikTok now. And, Chris at predatorpodcast.com if you have any questions for the podcast.
Amazing. I'll link that all below. Chris, once again,
Awesome.
Thank you so much, my friend.
Thanks, Louis. I appreciate it.